Welcome to our education research series. Maddie's insights are practical tips based on current research to help pets and people and that you can use in your shelter. Today, our guest is Dr. Katja Guenther, professor of gender and sexuality studies at the University of California in Riverside. You might know her as the acclaimed author of The Lives and Deaths of Shelter Animals. Today, she will explore how animal shelters and rescues contribute to problematic representations of disability and how these practices can harm animals. We'll look at ways we can challenge ableism and better serve our animals with disabilities. Let's welcome Dr. Guenther to learn more.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you all for joining us today for this conversation. I'm delighted to be here and to be able to talk with you about some of my current thinking and research about disability and ableism as it pertains to companion animals. So I'd like to just begin briefly with a land acknowledgement because I'm joining you as a faculty member from the University of California, which is a settler land grant institution that exists on the occupied, unceded, and ancestral lands of Indigenous people. My campus, UC Riverside, was built on and is currently expanding on land belonging to the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseno, and Serrano peoples and all of their relatives and relations, including creaturely kin, who of course are the focus of our conversation today, past, present, and future. I'm grateful to learn from the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, who also model a tradition of Indigenous resistance, community survivance, and sovereignty in the face of settler colonialism. I acknowledge Indigenous lands, rights, and peoples as a starting point for telling the truth about the histories of violence from which the university and its employees and students have benefited. I strive to center Indigenous feminist knowledge and practice in my teaching and in my engagement with the university and local communities. As I said, I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to be here with all of you today. By way of brief visual introduction, I am a white woman in her late 40s with short red hair, wearing a khaki beige kind of shirt and sort of cat eye eyeglasses. I'll be starting just with a brief lay of the land so that we have a sense of where we're heading today. I'm going to start by introducing you a bit to the larger research project of which this presentation is one part. So I'll explain a little bit about my methodological approach in my research and also introduce you to how this part of the research kind of fits into the bigger picture. I'd then like to take a few minutes to introduce you to two sets of concepts that have been particularly influential in advancing my thinking about companion animal welfare and how companion animal welfare interacts with and often inadvertently reproduces ableism and ableist discourses. Those concepts are the concept of the ability-disability system and the concept of lively capital. So I'll tell you a little bit more about each of those and how they inform this work. Then I'll turn to share with you some of the findings from my research, which focuses on the different ways that shelters and rescues sometimes inadvertently uphold the ability-disability system, even as at the same time, they're often also challenging some of the problematic ideas we have in our society about disabled animals and disabled people. And I sort of break down that part of the presentation into three categories of people, although it's important to note that sometimes these groups of people also overlap. So those groups include shelter staff members, shelter volunteers, and then rescuers, people who are volunteering, and sometimes they have paid positions, but not often, in nonprofit rescue groups that are taking animals out of the shelter and then placing them through the rescue organization into adoptive homes. In particular, there's a lot of overlap between the second and third groups, where a lot of shelter volunteers are also volunteers with rescue organizations. And then importantly, we'll spend some time towards the latter portion of the presentation talking about some specific strategies that shelters and rescuers, anyone who's involved in providing care to companion animals, really more broadly, even outside of shelter settings, can utilize to try to rethink their own approaches to disabled animals and to try to challenge ableism through their practices and conversations about disability as it pertains to animals. So to start with just a little bit of background about the broader project, I conducted 4 years of field work in a high intake public animal shelter that I call the Pacific Animal Welfare Center. So you'll hear me mention the acronym PAW periodically in the presentation. That's referring to the shelter in which I conducted research in the LA metropolitan area. At the time that I was conducting the research, that shelter was typically receiving about 20,000 animals per year. And as a public animal facility and an open admission facility, it was sort of an underfunded, under-resourced organization that was also nested in a broader government bureaucracy that was often quite problematic and created a lot of limitations for people who were interested in trying to help animals in that environment. I also conducted fieldwork in the Los Angeles rescue community by attending different types of events sponsored by rescue organizations. I also fostered myself dozens of dogs, not all of whom, but the vast majority of whom had different types of disabilities themselves. And so that was a really important part of my experience, because as I'm talking today, I want all of you to know that a lot of what I'm talking about are also things that I did and that I participated in. And I emphasize that in part to just show that it's easy to kind of fall into certain dominant kinds of practices and discourses. Right, even when we have good intentions, we may end up doing things that are more complicated or problematic than we potentially realize. Finally, I also observed and collected information from the social and public media, primarily of Los Angeles-based rescues, but also of some national organizations, and particularly of national media producers like the Dodo, which is a website I'm sure many of you are familiar with that airs just a lot of content related to different types of animals. And I was focusing there on their content related to companion animal welfare. So all of this research I conducted as part of my work for my book, The Lives and Deaths of Shelter Animals, which is a book that really focuses on showing how animals' chances, both of ending up in a shelter in the first place, but then of whether or not they survive in the shelter environment, are really powerfully linked to human inequalities of race, class, gender, ability and disability, and species. I do talk about disability in the book. It is part of the analysis. But since writing the book, it's something that I've really wanted to return to, in part because it is an area of inequality that is so often overlooked, both in scholarly literature, but also in real life, right? In terms of what's actually happening and what people are talking about and thinking about in the context of animal shelters and animal rescues, and more broadly, within the world of people who have companion animals in their homes. So this presentation is very near and dear to my heart because it gives me an opportunity to talk a bit more about the importance of thinking about disability in our conversations about companion animals. So to start thinking about disability, I'd like to introduce you to the concept of the ability or disability system. This was a term coined by a scholar named Rosemary Collard Thompson, who introduced it as a way to make clear that disability is a core organizing principle of society. We have kind of parallel terms in academic research, and I think also in popular language, for talking about systems of inequality that lead to unfair and unequal outcomes for different people, right? For instance, in feminist research, which I do a lot of, we talk about patriarchy or cis heteropatriarchy. And that term patriarchy is really about a social structure of which behaviors and attitudes and practices like sexism and misogyny are a part. And so Rosemary Collard Thompson, in talking about ability and disability as a system, wants us to be thinking about how our ideas and practices of disability are really embedded into our social structures at every level. They're not just about individuals having ableist attitudes towards others, right? It's not just about what people as individuals think and feel. It's also about how our social universe is organized. So she defines the ability-disability system as a pervasive cultural system that stigmatizes certain kinds of bodily variations while privileging others as desirable, valuable, and powerful. And this definition, you'll note, also helps encompass other types of bodily variations beyond ability and disability. It helps us think, too, about inequalities of perceptions of attractiveness, for example, fat phobia, lots of different ways in which bodies in our society are deemed to be either worthier or less worthy. And she notes that the ability-disability system is the social structure that maintains inequalities between disabled and able-bodied and able-minded people. Ableism, rather than being a social structure in the same way, is a set of beliefs and practices that devalues and discriminates against people with physical, intellectual, or psychiatric disabilities. And ableism also often rests on the assumption that disabled people and disabled animals, as we'll talk more about, need to be fixed or cured in some way, right? That is sort of the intrinsic desire often of ableist discourses, is to try to do something to remedy or resolve or fix a disability, right? Disability is seen in our culture as a defect, right? As something that is problematic. Our ideas about disability in Western culture have long been tied to our ideas about animals. And this is part of why I think it's so important for people who are involved in companion animal care broadly to think about disability. Some of these connections emerged several centuries ago, particularly as an outcome or part of Western rational thinking, in which animals and disabled people are often seen as being similar to each other in that they are understood as lacking certain skills or abilities. And it's important to note that disability has been key to justifying human domination over and human exploitation of animals, but also at the same time that beliefs and practices related to animals have been key to justifying the domination and valuing of ability over disability. So just to elaborate on that briefly, and this is something we could do a whole separate session on, we substantially justify our different forms of violence against animals, whether it's factory farming or factory fishing, hunting, caging, like we do in so many shelters, reproductive control, policing and animal control, and so forth, by arguing that animals are intellectually or cognitively and or physically inferior to humans. That is, that they're less than us because they have some of the same attributes that some disabled people have. Right? So we justify that we can slaughter billions of chickens every year because chickens are dumb animals. We justify that we can make decisions about sterilizing our cats and dogs because we have the intellectual capacity to make decisions on their behalf as their stewards that we don't see them as possessing. So the rhetoric, right, centers on the idea that animals are lacking in many of the same ways that we understand disabled people as lacking. And we also see at the same time how our language about animals is so often used in ableist conversations. Even eugenics, right, the philosophy and practice of trying to cull or remove certain types of perceived undesirable humans from the population, right, has its origins in zoo biology. And animal breeding practices, right, about selecting for desirable traits and culling those animals, which many animal breeders of companion animals in the US continue to do, right, simply putting to sleep or eliminating animals who are born with undesirable breed traits. This is really all tied up in ideas about humans and animals together. So Sonora Taylor, who's written a brilliant book about disability and ableism, writes that ableism helps construct the systems that render the lives and experiences of both non-human animals and disabled humans as less valuable and as discardable, which leads to a variety of oppressions that manifest differently. Right? So the argument in pointing out the connection between disability and animality is not to say that disabled people and animals experience identical oppressions. Thankfully, right, in the United States, we do not factory farm and slaughter disabled people, right? We do that to animals. So there's different manifestations of this. But the language, the rhetoric, the logic, and the thinking about ability is what helps able-bodied culture and the ability-disability system to continue to justify violence and control against both disabled humans, but also against animals, all animals, and then, as we'll talk more about too in a little bit, disabled animals specifically. So you might already have concluded that my research begins by troubling some of these linkages between humans and animals in the construction of disability. I approach my research by utilizing two key perspectives, a disability justice perspective and a multi-species justice perspective. And I'll just introduce each of those very briefly in a couple of sentences. Disability justice is a perspective that holds that all bodies are unique and that all bodies have different types of needs that require being met, and that we're all ultimately inherently interdependent, right? Sort of countering the individualistic logic that is so prevalent, especially here in the United States, but really in most Western capitalist societies. There's a strong emphasis in disability justice on showing the different ways that we're interconnected and interdependent, and that all people have needs that we help each other meet. A disability justice perspective also recognizes that race, class, gender, sexuality, disability are interconnected systems of inequality and identity, and that we need to tackle those systems of inequality together rather than trying to parse them out individually or only paying attention to one of them and not paying attention to the others. And that's really where a disability justice perspective differs from the earlier disability rights perspective, which was much more of a one issue kind of movement, right? Focused very much on rights for disabled people, but without paying attention to how the experiences of disabled women might be different from those of disabled men, for instance. Multi-species justice, in turn, is a theory of justice that includes the interests of all humans and of non-humans, and not just animals, but also flora, bodies of water, and ecosystems. As Danielle Sellermeyer has written, recognizing that non-humans, and I'm quoting her, have justice claims means there is a moral and political obligation for the basic institutions of society, including our political and legal systems, and I would argue our shelter systems, to take those interests into account when making decisions. So a multi-species justice perspective asks us to pay attention to the needs and desires of non-human entities and to bring them into different types of decision-making processes. At present, this is not generally a dominant perspective in the United States in general, nor have I personally encountered it within the companion animal welfare industry. So you'll likely notice today as I'm talking that I might bring up some ideas that kind of butt heads with ideas that you might already have or that you've been exposed to. And that's totally expected and totally welcome. I engage with trying to think really far outside the box because I think that helps move us in new and provocative directions that hopefully will help us achieve significant change that betters living conditions for everyone. So finally, conceptually, I want to introduce you to the idea of thinking about companion animals as lively capital. And lively capital is a term that's been used by different scholars in the field of animal studies that really emphasizes how companion animals have become commodified in our society. While we tend to think of companion animals as family members or being like family members too are commodified in Western capitalist societies, insofar as we evaluate and assess people's value based on market-determined conditions, and also because we seek to interact with and change living beings, whether they're our children or our companion animals, by buying different things for them and providing them with different types of material resources. Rosemary Claire Collard is one of many scholars who talks about the idea of lively capital. And I think she provides a useful definition that I've included as the first bullet point on this slide. She refers to animals with the language of it. I tend to use they, but I'm going to use her original language here. So she notes that in Western capitalist societies, companion animals are lively capital, a living thing with economic value because of its not thingness, its liveliness and sentience, its capacity to respond to and interact with humans, its ability to be encountered as a living being, as a companion. So what Collard is emphasizing here is that the value of companion animals lies in their aliveness, right? Hence this use of the term lively capital, right? This is capital that is actually living. And humans value companion animals precisely because we can interact with them. We can build relationships with them. And in some ways, right, we can alter their behavior and we can use the market, right, to acquire the kinds of companion animals that we view as most desirable. We can just think about the current boom in French bulldog popularity, for example, right? These dogs that I'm sure many of us who are present here know are prone to all manner of health issues and typically are not coming into homes out of shelters, but rather through breeding. But who've become so popular in part because of their infantile kind of expression, their seemingly agreeable public disposition, and so forth, and that they're small, so people can bring them to different locations relatively easily. So those features of them, right, increase their market value. The fact that they're cute and they kind of look like, I don't know, strange babies, that they've got these big eyes, that they're kind of round and silly looking, that we can make them portable and bring them with us. Those are all things that increase their market value. Disabled animals, in contrast, are generally those with the lowest market value. They're typically seen as being the least desirable companion animals because of a number of different reasons, including that they're often seen as requiring too many resources. That might mean both financial or veterinary type resources, how much money has to be spent at the vet or on medication, but also the resources of time and energy, right? I always say, if I had even 5 cents for every time I gave a pill or injected an animal in my household, I would be a very affluent person, right? I spend a lot of time every day providing that kind of labor, as I'm sure many here do as well. Further, disabled animals may be seen as not being able to satisfy the expectations that we humans have for companion animals, right? We have certain standards of what it is that we are hoping for in our relationship with a companion animal. So a dog who may be reactive and intermittently bites their guardian, for instance, is going to have a lower level of appeal and marketability because they are living with presumably some type of behavioral or psychiatric issue. A dog with 3 legs perhaps can't meet a particular guardian's desire for having a dog that they can take on 10-mile hikes every weekend. Right, so there's different ways in which disabled animals might be seen as not satisfying human expectations for animals. And I would note here that there is a difference that I have observed and that others have observed, that acquiring a disabled animal from a shelter or a rescue or a breeder, wherever people are sourcing animals, is a different experience than acquiring a disabled animal who is the same animal that someone has been caring for lifelong or for a very long time and who becomes ill or disabled. Right? So a substantial majority of people with companion animals in their lives are expecting that that animal will age and may develop age-related disabilities. They may have limitations of seeing or hearing or arthritis or whatever it may be. That is a different kind of tolerance, a much higher level of tolerance for that type of accrued disability in an animal one already has a relationship with than there is in going out and seeking and adopting or purchasing an animal with a known disability. I personally, in all my years at the shelter, never heard somebody come into the shelter and say that they were looking for a cat with kidney disease to adopt, right? That's not something that is a criteria, right? People don't come in typically looking for animals with disabilities, and they're often quite adverse to disabled animals. Moving to thinking about disabled animals in the context of the animal shelter, I want to emphasize that what kinds of animal bodies and minds are considered disabled in the shelter is in substantial part the outcome of social processes taking place in that environment. Both veterinary staff, but also management, volunteers, sometimes even members of the public, will shape if and how a particular animal is understood to be disabled, and also whether or not that disability is understood to be limiting. I've included on this slide just some images of different types of characteristics that in the Pacific Animal Welfare Center, or PAW, where I volunteered and did my research, would have been considered disabilities, right? A so-called tripod, or a dog with 3 legs, would be considered a disabled animal. So would potentially an animal who expresses hostility, like the Chihuahua shown in the middle photograph, towards humans, especially if they attempt to bite or bite people. Or animals, cats and dogs, who have symptoms of upper respiratory infections. And in a shelter context and in a rescue context, there's different kinds of factors that shape whether or not an animal is seen as disabled. Some of you may be part of shelter and rescue organizations that don't really think about upper respiratory infection, for instance, as a really problematic condition. But in the shelter where I was volunteering and doing research, it was. So it's going to vary depending on the presentation of the animal in question, the resources of a facility or organization, the training and experience of the shelter staff, including vets and vet techs, but also other staff members, and even the history of experience in the broader shelter community with a particular type of disease, right? A shelter that has previously lost a substantial number of cats in a panleukopenia outbreak is likely going to be more likely to categorize an animal who comes in and they're told was exposed to panleukopenia, right, as an animal that requires special, different treatment and is functionally classified as disabled, right? So that is the outcome of a range of sources. So at the Pacific Animal Welfare Center, what I observed among the staff typically is that animals were classified as disabled based on different types of claims about their mental and physical health, but also specifically about claims relating to their independence and the need for care. So the shelter's inability to provide care for certain types of conditions would mean that certain types of animals would be considered disabled, even if perhaps in the broader public, we all would not consider that kind of animal disabled. In my research, I found that disabled animals generally included those animals with temporary or chronic illnesses. So it could be something short-term, like upper respiratory infection, or something that's assumed to be longer term, like very large tumors or evidence of arthritis, etc. Mobility impairments, including injured or missing limbs, deafness or blindness, disfigurement, especially if it was significant and took place on the face, in the facial or neck area, neurological and behavioral issues, which include things like seizures and tics, but also behavioral issues like fearfulness or reactivity, as well as animals who were very old and show signs of age-related advancement, so arthritis or vision or hearing loss that seems to be because an animal is old, or alternately, like the little kittens shown on the slide, who are very young and aren't able to survive without special support, like bottle feeding. So the definitions of disability that were used by staff at PAW include both temporary and permanent conditions. Animals were considered disabled if they really had any health issue or characteristic, whether temporary or chronic, curable, permanent, or fatal, that would make them less likely than a so-called healthy or normal animal to be adopted by a member of the general public. And some animals who didn't even have any disability themselves would be understood as disability if they posed a threat of contagion. So going back to that example, for instance, of a cat who's been exposed to panleukopenia, right? That would be a cat who would also be understood as disabled, even though they're presenting as fully healthy. And the consequence for that at a high intake shelter like PAW was that these animals were typically fast-tracked to be put down in the shelter environment, right? In some cases, that decision was made almost immediately upon impound, At other times, there was more time provided to see how an animal fared in the shelter environment before that happened. But consistently, animals with any type of disability were far more likely to be killed at the shelter than those without disability. The second group I wanted to talk about, shelter volunteers, have a very different response to disability and often resist how the shelter as an institution responds to disability. They would push back against how the shelter designated disability, and they would sometimes even counter staff narratives and claims about animals' abilities, trying to show the staff that an animal whose staff said couldn't do something could in fact do that thing, or by drawing on their own veterinary or personal knowledge to kind of challenge claims that veterinary staff or other staff were making about how they were interpreting the progression of a particular animal. So in my book, for example, I talk about one dog who had a severe upper respiratory infection and who had been authorized to be put down at the end of a particular day because of that illness. Myself and other volunteers resisted the shelter's assertion that the dog was getting worse by showing instead ways in which we thought that she was improving. So there was dialogue and sometimes tension between staff and volunteers around disability. Shelter volunteers also typically resist the idea that disabled animals are somehow undesirable companions. And they would resist this idea both in interactions with shelter staff, showing shelter staff how these animals were like other animals, like that they could be trained to sit or lie down, or that they could run and fetch balls, or that they loved belly rubs, or whatever it might be. So they focused on staff, but they also focused on encouraging adopters who came into the shelter to consider disabled animals and to again show how these animals, using this assimilationist kind of framework around disability, were like able-bodied or able-minded animals. That often also involved educating prospective adopters about disabilities and to show prospective adopters if and how a particular disability could be treated or managed. So volunteers might provide information on their experience with what it cost to repair a torn ACL, or what the progression looks like in recovering from Demodex mange or something like that. They'd have these conversations with adopters trying to promote the adoption of animals the shelter was viewing as disabled. Rescuers have a somewhat different situation because they're not operating in the context of a shelter environment and they're not open admission. But rescues often engage with disabled animals, and several rescues in the Los Angeles area really focus on trying to help animals who specifically have health issues that have resulted in them being viewed as disabled and unadoptable within the local shelter system. Rescuers respond to disability in a number of different ways. I want to point out first that one of the clear observations that I made in my research is that rescuers are very careful in selecting which types of disabled dogs they rescue in the first place. So rescues don't necessarily go out, right, and take any disabled dog who's available at a shelter, or even the disabled dog or cat who's most likely to be put down at a certain period, or who shelter staff say is most urgent. They have their own criteria and they curate for themselves a population of animals to whom that rescue is going to provide care. And that curating involves processes that have to do with their ties, social ties and connections with humans at a specific shelter, like the volunteers and staff they might know at a shelter. But it also has to do with perceptions of adoptability, thinking back again to the idea of lively capital, knowing that a pit bull with mange is, at the end of the day, going to be harder for them to adopt out than a poodle with mange, right? So they're going to be more likely to take the poodle and to leave the pit bull behind. Once rescues have brought disabled animals into rescue, they frequently talk about that process of having the animals in rescue through their posts on different types of social media, like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and so forth. And a lot of that material falls into a category that disability scholars refer to as inspiration porn. I've underlined that term on the slide. Inspiration porn refers to the representation of disabled people or animals specifically as inspirational because of their ability to cope with the disabilities that they're living with. And inspiration porn has been critiqued as a problematic representation of disabled bodies and minds for a number of reasons, including that it really sets disabled bodies and minds apart from able bodies and minds, so makes them really marked as different. It also tends to view disability rather than the societal response to disability as problematic and needing to be overcome on an individual basis. So inspiration porn involving rescued animals often shows them, for instance, as so-called super crips who are overcoming their disability to achieve remarkable feats. I think, for example, of a pit bull who is shown in videos performing parkour, even though he was also using a wheelchair for his back legs. So these super crips and the inspiration porn that they're part of really highlight and focus on individual animals as overcoming disability without looking at the broader social context of how animals became disabled and also what the community resources are that are necessary and required for that animal to overcome those disabilities. And for many animals and people, that overcoming also isn't possible. So rescuers utilize these different elements of inspiration porn, often including showing disabled animals as infantile, so looking particularly baby-like or needy. This often includes also dressing animals up in like onesies and things like that. Inspiration porn also tends to show disabled animals as very helpless and in need of a savior. And that savior overwhelmingly is the director of the rescue, right? That is the person who's meant to be kind of the hero of these narratives of animals overcoming disability. And rescuers routinely utilize disability specifically for fundraising. Some of the rescuers who I spoke with shared with me financial information about how much more lucrative it was for them to rescue a disabled animal than an animal without disabilities, because people were much, much more likely to donate for a disabled animal. I would also note, having talked now about a couple of ways in which rescues represent disabled animals in ways that reinforce problematic ideas from our disability system, to also observe that rescues are helping disabled animals by showing the value of disabled animals as companions, right? Showing that they still are valuable, lively capital, and showing that the needs that they have can often be met in very simple ways if people are willing to be a little creative. I include here, for example, an image from a Los Angeles area's rescue of two Chihuahuas, both of whom don't have front legs, right? And they're shown eating food out of bowls, but they're resting their front bodies on paper towel rolls so that they're able to eat or drink, I'm not sure which it is there, without tipping in or falling in, right? This is a very easy solution. This is something that anyone would be able to do. And so it's showing a valuable, I think, representation of these dogs. So thinking now about some of the strategies that advocates for companion animals can utilize in paying better and more and different attention to disability among companion animals. As I've shown in the shelter environment where I conducted research, the shelter response to disability was typically hostile, right? It was an orientation that was generally kind of eugenicist, right? The idea that disabled animals should simply be removed from the pool of adoptable animals, again, depending on the specific type of disability. Volunteers resisted that, but with varying degrees of success. And then rescuers sometimes participated in problematic representations of disabled animals, even as at the same time they are helping these disabled animals. So I'd like to use the remaining time to focus on ways of making change and especially of making explicit commitments One thing that I've observed now, having been involved in a substantial number of shelter research studies, is that shelters and rescue organizations aren't typically thinking at all about how they're helping disabled animals or if they're helping them at all. So a first step, I think, towards eventuating change and improving the life chances and conditions for disabled animals is that shelters and rescues, and really any organization working with companion animals, needs to evaluate their current practices around disability and articulate their commitment to caring for disabled animals and considering the interests of disabled animals in their policies. And I think this is something that ideally would be added in many cases to existing mission statements. And it's especially important that the development of any new type of policy, and really any conversation at all that is happening about the goals of an organization or of a group of people who are working to better conditions for animals, include diverse actors. So in the case of a shelter, for instance, staff should be involved in a conversation like this, but so should volunteers and community members. And pointing back to the idea of multi-species justice, part of thinking about those different groups of humans is also thinking about if and how those groups of humans might be able to represent the interests of disabled and other animals themselves in the process as well. Right, so bringing in people to the conversation who have a lot of experience working with animals with disability would be a really important and valuable part of evaluating current practices around disability and developing a new position about that going forward. Shelters and other organizations should also make a commitment to not using health or disability to select animals for death, barring, of course, cases of extreme suffering. Nor should this status be used ever to close off adoption options. It was a standard practice, for example, at PAW to only make animals who had any type of health or illness issue available to rescue groups. That is not a policy that is going to help facilitate more disabled animals exiting shelters. And finally, shelters and rescues should strive to treat the full range of disabilities, both psychological and physical disabilities that companion animals can have. Even if there are resource constraints that may make it challenging at this particular moment to eventuate that, it needs to be part of a long-term plan, a set of goals that shelters and organizations have, also so that it's kept in mind how that can be achieved, perhaps even to some degree with what resources are available. In terms of issues of representation and outreach and education, it's also important for people not to depict disabled animals in ways that reinforce dominant negative ideas about disability. So disabled animals shouldn't be shown as pitiable or sensational, spectacular, or as being more or less valuable than abled animals. Companion animal welfare industry participants of all types can work to educate adopters and the general public about animals with disabilities and the different kinds of variations in animals' bodies and minds that frequently take place. In the context of shelters and rescue organizations, staff and volunteers should be trained about how to talk about animal disability in ways that don't scare adopters away from disabled animals. One thing that I unfortunately have observed in many shelters is that staff members in particular provide information about health to prospective adopters in such a way that it sounds maximally terrorizing, right? Like, this dog has diarrhea, they may just have an upset stomach, but they might also have colorectal cancer, right? That kind of language is not useful or helpful in communicating with the public. And when long-term care needs are expected, there are usually ways in which shelters and rescues can work with prospective adopters to secure reduced rate veterinary care or behavioral care as well. So that's something that organizations can think about. And then finally, I want to conclude by talking about some of the ways in which shelters and rescues can try to address disability in their communities. not simply focusing on animals who are already in shelters or in rescues. Because I see so many ways that shelters and rescuers could be participating in helping communities prevent disability and also helping support keeping disabled animals in their original homes. So I've included on this slide some of those ideas, including strategies like opening shelter clinics to the community when those clinics aren't in use for shelter animals. It's very common across the country that an animal shelter only uses their hospital or clinic 5 days a week, and 2 days a week it's sitting empty. Perhaps there are ways to partner with local veterinarians and or with the veterinarians who already work at the shelter to turn that unused time into time where community animals can receive services. The implementation of community vaccine programs for common diseases and injuries can help prevent many causes of disability. Here in California, where I'm joining you from, the government just passed a law allowing vet techs to administer many types of vaccines and also some types of medications, even when a veterinarian is not present. And laws like that are going to make mobile clinics a lot more possible here in the Southern California area, where we have a significant homeless animal issue. Right now, some animal control departments like LA County Animal Care and Control send paid canvassers out door to door to seek out households who have unlicensed animals and to find them and to get those animals licensed. And that often involves an intaking, unfortunately, animals, because some people can't afford those fees and surrender their animals rather than figure out how to pay. I imagine a world where instead of sending out canvassers to penalize folks for not having licenses, that we send out vet techs who can administer vaccinations. In the shelter, having shelter enrichment and behavioral programs for impounded animals is key. Assisting the community with repairing enclosures or providing other services that help keep companion animals in safe spaces. That also includes educating the community on the importance of keeping cats indoors. We all, I'm sure, are familiar, many of us in here, with the data on the differences in lifespan and health for indoor versus outdoor cats. So just keeping cats inside can make such a difference. And then even advocating and working with different types of government agencies that perhaps we haven't thought about before as partners, to accomplish things like perhaps lowering speed limits or adding safety bumps or putting up fencing along freeways, in areas where there's high animal presence, to reduce car strikes, which are a common source of animal disability as well. So I think there's a lot of tools that are available to us and that become available to us when we actually start thinking about disability as an issue that we need to address within companion animal welfare, and when we start thinking about how shelters and rescues can do a better job engaging with disability and helping and supporting the disabled animals who come into our care and who I know we're all so eager to care for. So my last slide just includes the sources I've mentioned in this presentation, as well as some additional suggestions for further reading, if any of you are interested in looking at additional materials. And I believe that that will also be posted into the chat so that you will have that there. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Guenther. If an organization had a pet who had, let's say, like a behavior issue, I often see organizations they kind of market them on the issues. What would you recommend? How would you recommend they handle that?
So when you said that you often see them market them on the issues, are you saying that you've seen organizations where they kind of highlight the disability as the reason for someone to consider adopting?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've seen that quite a bit as well. I'm not familiar with any data that actually gets into the nitty-gritty of whether that kind of marketing strategy is effective or not. I do think that in terms of because we do, unfortunately, operate now in this model of animals as commodities, that we are trying to show animals with their best foot forward. But we also don't want to be hoodwinking people, right, into adopting animals that have conditions that perhaps we know about. And, and I think that's really where a lot of the training can be useful for helping staff and volunteers learn how to talk about disability without ending up on sort of either end of the scale, where you don't want to be dishonest, right, and hiding information, but you also don't want to be scaring people by making things sound like they're a lot worse than they may be. And I think there is a middle ground in there, and that can be mentioned. Disability certainly can be talked about in promotional materials for animals, but I don't think that typically it's beneficial for an animal for that to be the front and center piece. And also, also in terms of how that sort of messages back about other animals and disabled humans as well, right?
Absolutely. We have a question from Nicholas. He says, "This was such a great presentation. I am struggling with the viewpoint that many disabilities are the result of artificial selection. Is it wrong to discourage indiscriminate breeding practices?"
That's such an interesting question. Is it wrong to discourage indiscriminate breeding practices? Well, there's so much complexity about breeding in general, right? Especially in terms of shelter dynamics. My response would be that from a disability justice perspective, there is always attention to celebrating the experiences and the lives and the richness that the diversity of different types of bodies and minds bring to our social worlds. Anyone who has had a relationship or is themselves a disabled person or with a disabled animal knows that the world is richer and more interesting, and that we learn so much about ourselves as well as humans through our encounters with differently abled and differently minded animals and people. At the same time, it's not an intention of the disability justice perspective to embrace suffering, right? And some disabilities do cause, right, significant amounts of discomfort and suffering. And so disability justice activists are always paying attention to the ways that we can work to try to reduce suffering among any population through prevention, right? And in the case of animals, vaccines, for example, or potentially other approaches that would reduce disability in a population with the express purpose of reducing suffering, right? Again, not all disabilities cause suffering. And that's really important to keep in mind. We have, I think, an overall mindset in the US that if someone has a disability, that their quality of life is automatically lower than someone who doesn't have that same disability. And if you actually talk with disabled people, the problem that they have is not usually with their own body or mind, it's with how the society responds to it, right? How many barriers are put up for them to have equal access and equal participation. So I'm just thinking through like genetic things, that happen, in dog breeding, that breeders try to breed out, like hip dysplasia, for example, as a condition. And I'm not a veterinarian, so I don't want to make, strong veterinary claims, but I have been told by veterinarians that some dogs with dysplasia on an X-ray don't actually have any symptoms ever, right? So is that actually something that we need to be trying to breed out so much if there's not actually the suffering associated with it? I don't know. So that's not a firm answer to your question, Nicholas, but I just wanted to sort of approach it from the disability justice perspective. We want to try to minimize suffering while also supporting and celebrating the presence of disabled bodies and animals. And I see Donna posting that, stop breeding animals with smushed faces so they struggle to breathe with their whole lives. Yes. Every time I see a French bulldog, I feel a bit sad.
One more question we had about the term disabled. The person says, "I'm not comfortable using the term disabled because to me it has connotations that I don't love. but differently abled is just as offensive. So what is the best way to describe pets and people with different characteristics, or other than just calling them people or dogs and cats?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will say within the disabled community, and it's always a challenge when we talk about a community, because who is representing any community? But it's my universal experience as someone who's lives with disability and as someone who conducts research on disability, that disabled people prefer to be referred to as disabled, not as people with disabilities, nor as differently abled. So the preferred language is disabled or disability. You might think about what it is about that term that makes you so uncomfortable, and perhaps try to engage with it a little bit differently and think about some of the ways too in which disability is simply another expression of variation in human bodies, and that there's a lot of great things about disability. I don't know if that would help bring a more positive view to it for you.
Can you clarify when we use the word disability, that because most people assume the condition is permanent?
Yeah, that's a great question. And disability, I mean, as with any concept, there's competing ways of defining it. Disability, as it's generally defined by like the Center for Disease Control, right, in the federal government, typically focuses on whether someone is experiencing a period of time in which they are unable to bathe or dress themselves or meet other basic needs independently, so without assistance. And usually there's also some cognitive measures of disability, like is a person able to understand a basic legal document without needing someone else to support them. Sometimes people differentiate between temporary and permanent disabilities, but generally not so much. Someone who sees themselves as being disabled is usually someone who is living with a permanent or semi-permanent disability. Whereas a temporary disability, right, is something like breaking your femur or your arm, or different kinds of hip replacement, whatever might come up in life. You may have a temporary disability where you're not able to care for yourself fully, and you need that support. And in the shelter environment, I personally have not observed much of a breakdown between temporary and permanent disability. And interestingly, in my research, some disabilities were actually caused by the shelter. So that's another thing I think, sheltering organizations need to think about, is how they are actually causing disabilities to happen. And in some cases, the cure, if you will, the resolution to the disability is exiting the shelter. So we'd have animals at the shelter where I did my field work who would be classified as suffering from zoochosis, right, kennel stress. And so they would be killed. But the solution actually would be to remove them from the shelter, right? That would presumably be curative. So there's lots of different ways that, as I mentioned in the presentation, disability is a fluid term. Individuals define it differently, but then it's also defined collectively differently. And in the shelter where I was, temporary disabilities like upper respiratory infections were seen through a lens of and the language of disability, but they might not be in other shelters.
Absolutely. One last question. Would you consider animals with behavior issues to be disabled?
Yeah, I would. Generally speaking, animals with behavior issues, assuming that they are behavior issues that in some way map onto current knowledge and thinking about mental health and mental wellness. But yes, my answer would be yes. And behavioral issues like reactivity, aggression, are especially those that are likely to result in animals having negative outcomes from shelter environments, even though, as I was just talking about, sometimes that's actually triggered by the shelter itself, by the shelter environment.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Guenther, and thanks to everyone else who has been here and joined us today. Dr. Guenther will be available on Maddie's Pet Forum to continue this discussion, so feel free to post more questions there. And thank you all so much. We will see you next time.